Good afternoon, folks. This is Anil Khurana. I'm the Executive Director of the Baratta Center for Global Business at Georgetown University and a Professor of Practice at the McDonough School of Business. I have with me Professor Marc Busch, who's a Karl F. Landegger Professor of International Business, a renowned expert in international business, trade, and global investments. Marc, welcome, and glad to have you on this podcast.
Glad to be here.
So, Marc, lots has happened in the last few days. We expected lots to happen. And especially, I think we talk about trade and President Trump's initial intents and then what's happened in the last few days. So let me start off by asking, what did you expect that didn't happen on Monday?
Well, what didn't happen on Monday was an executive order issuing an across-the-board tariff. That didn't happen. And that had been hyped up, obviously, on the campaign trail as being one of the day one initiatives. 25% on Canada, 25% on Mexico, 10% on top of maybe 60% on China. Who knew? And yet, what we got instead was a memorandum calling for a bunch of studies to be done by April 1st in pursuit of the contours of something called an America First trade policy. And there are a lot of studies that are being called for here, and a lot of different agencies and departments that will surely have their hands full. But on the other hand, clearly Trump isn't waiting for the conclusions of those studies, because we also hear that the tariffs that didn't happen on Monday are probably going to happen by February 1st. That's with respect to both Canada, Mexico in particular, maybe sooner, maybe a little later on China. And as for April 1st, with respect to one of the more interesting elements, a study on the pros and cons, costs and benefits of various U.S. preferential trade agreements, there's also word that Trump has decided to move up the review of USMCA, which had been slated for summer 2026 and now could come at almost any time. So we're back to that dynamic we witnessed during Trump 1.0, namely there's what goes out in the official form and what is said on social media or to the press. And this has gotten everyone a little dizzy, not least those attending the gathering in Davos. And as a result, much to parse through, much to assess, and much to speculate about.
Thank you, Marc. So a lot packed in there. So if you can actually elaborate what's in the memo that you refer to, because really curious on what's there and what to expect and not to expect.
The big picture is that there's a lot of stuff and much of it has bipartisan support. It's a really important point to make up front. This is not Trump going out on a limb on everything. There's some very technical stuff here that has long garnered bipartisan support. And when you read through the list of items, it's not a stretch to say that a President Harris would have done much the same. But when you get into the details, let's start with the obvious. China gets a lot of attention. And the attention is interesting in the sense that we've got pieces moving in opposite directions. One, Trump wants a review of the phase one U.S.-China deal that he offered to China as a means of tempering some of the tariff anger that he had expressed. We know what the conclusion of that study will be. China did not live up to phase one obligations. The bigger picture, though, is that there is also a study to be done on whether the U.S. should suspend permanent normal trade relations with China as per legislation that's been floated for years in Congress, calling for the same outcome. So you can imagine that that's the lightning rod issue, PNTR for China. But the question then becomes, what's the negotiating strategy here with respect to also doing the review of phase one U.S.-China, which should, in all likelihood, lead to a discussion about phase two, which had been promised at the time. The problem being, it's hard to negotiate phase two when you're on the brink of denying China MFN at the WTO by revoking PNTR. So we've got some pieces here that are moving in different directions, and it's hard to deduce the negotiating strategy that's going on. There's a study on currency manipulation. That's kind of new. Obviously, USMCA has a currency manipulation chapter, so it's not unprecedented, but the attention that it's getting is rather interesting. A lot of talk about reciprocity, which can be read either way. First, that Trump is going to continue to harp about how the U.S. is being unfairly treated by so many. Two, that we want things that are reciprocal and are willing to open trade to get there, which leads to another study, the pros and cons of trade agreements writ large. That's a little bit encouraging. We didn't hear much of that kind of conversation under Biden. And moreover, when Biden did roll out something akin to a trade deal, namely the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, it was neutered of any market access commitments, drew the wrath of business in the United States for being feckless, which begs the question, when Trump talks about identifying countries with which the U.S. might pursue bilateral or mini-lateral trade deals, what would they look like? Would they be like U.S.-China Phase 1, which largely centered on purchasing commitments, practically barter? Or would it be more classical in the sense of market access, multiple chapters, a lot of coverage, maybe even, with a wink and a nod, making this compliant with WTO expectations for doing a PTA right? So take all that, and it's hard to imagine Trump envisions Congress having much appetite for a big deal, which leads then to the question, what would a sector-specific deal look like? And he mentions that in the memorandum. It doesn't have to be an across-the-board bilateral trade deal. It could be a sector-specific deal. Congress has been playing with this for a while now. Think critical minerals and materials. Think the Americas Act on textiles. We've got a lot of examples of sector-specific efforts, but those become exhausting. A lot of claimants, hard to disappoint. You're going to have a big agricultural component because ag in this country is still waiting to be made whole after the retaliatory reprisals, especially by China over the Section 301 tariffs. Never mind what other countries did with respect to retaliating for the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. But nonetheless, it's a positive sign that there's even a notion that we should be listing out countries that might be up front in the queue to get a preferential trade agreement. And clearly we can guess where that one is heading. That's going to be the UK. Trump flirted with the UK in his first administration. Odds are he'll return. But after the UK, where are we looking? Is it that we go to Kenya, which had done a lot of work in terms of preparation for a deal over several different administrations? Is that where Trump would then turn, or does he have someone else in mind? And through what lenses does he look at these countries, allies, adversaries? And prior to inauguration, the easy answer would have been allies versus adversaries. But with this saber rattling going on, including in Davos today, with respect to Canada, it's hard to imagine that anything is that straightforward.
So Mark, one of the things you mentioned is the studies that are going on as part of the memorandum. Do you expect these studies to be, well, first of all, done by April 1st? And secondly, to be clear enough to actually offer any direct guidance, or are these really tools for doing what he proposes to do?
It could be good political theater to make this look like a carefully thought out roadmap investigation. There's no doubt that the ITC and other agencies have lots of off the shelf projects that they can pull, aggregate, add some new content to, and deliver by April 1st. The big mystery, though, which must surely be on the minds of those in Davos, is would any conclusion really matter? Or is this all preordained in terms of the likely policies and actions that would be forthcoming? Mind you, some of the papers that are being called for, some of the studies that are being asked for here, get into technical minutia that the US has been considering for decades. One example is, and this will surely come as no relief to those concerned about the tsunami of tariffs that we're waiting for, anti-dump countervail. Trump has a standalone study looking to see whether we've got all the trade remedies stuff right. And in that write-up, he calls for, at least hints at, another look at a zeroing methodology for anti-dumping duties. That is, again, one of these bipartisan interests. You've got a lot of support for zeroing methodology and anti-dump here in the United States. The challenge being, of course, that the U.S. lost 3 consecutive times at the WTO on zeroing, and other countries lost zeroing as well. But the U.S. has long been of the view that the WTO overstepped in striking down zeroing, that the U.S. never put it up for negotiation, and that the appellate body was doing lawmaking by concluding 3 times that this was afoul of WTO obligations. To resuscitate zeroing in a study, which surely will come to that conclusion, i.e. the need to do so, is provocative to say the least, but not unexpected. And that, after all, is one of the cases that led the U.S. to push against the appellate body and for Trump to shut it down in 2019. So, to repeat, a lot of stuff being called for. Much of it has bipartisan support. Much of it would have been pursued by a Harris administration as well. None of it is brand new to the Trump administration. What would be looming as the question to get asked is, does the conclusion of any of these studies really make any difference in terms of what he has in mind?
Yep. So this may be getting a little specific, and you mentioned this earlier, with China, which is one of the key targets of both the Trump administration and also, as we said, would have been for Kamala Harris as well. What's the end goal? What do we expect to achieve?
You're absolutely right. The Biden administration gave a lot of the flavor for the language being used to describe all things China, and Trump has followed suit. We're seeing the word unfair, predatory non-market economy, etc. These terms have meaning in trade. The issue of non-market economy status with respect to calculations of dumping and subsidy margins, for example. This is really interesting, though, in the sense that the Biden administration also wanted to make China the target and never really articulated, as you say, the end game. And word is that USTR on her way out was of the view that maybe more could have been done with respect to China. But to what end? To convert it to a market economy? Was it to discipline its economic coercion? That seems to be the new bailiwick, that it's not just that China is a non-market economy looking to grow its way out of economic woes by massively subsidizing excess exports, etc., but that the economic coercion that follows with that is reprehensible and must be met with an answer. There, the challenge, though, is that clearly Trump does want to take seriously a review of phase 1 U.S.-China, potentially propose something for phase 2 U.S.-China, knows that decoupling would be crippling of the U.S. economy, and therefore really has to kind of come up with a better narrative, not least when it seems the U.S. is leading on the economic coercion front, at least in the short term. For whatever China is doing, the U.S. seems to be mimicking some of that economic coercion, it's hard then to condemn it in the same breath.
Yeah, and of course with China, the other factors that are added are the smuggling of fentanyl and other things that becomes part of the same package, even though it's not a trade package. But I think if the principle of tariffs is reasonable, then adding that sort of lever is perhaps not unreasonable. What's your view?
I see it as a broader effort to declare a national emergency, and that so that he can use the IEPA to follow through on his threat for across the board tariffs. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, an acronym that we're all going to become very familiar with quickly. To do that, because it's nested under the National Emergencies Act, he's going to have to look for indicators of emergency circumstances. The fentanyl move I thought was politically brilliant. It's difficult to conceive of a ready-made solution. Why not punish and make it a campaign promise delivered by virtue of threatening tariffs, including against Canada, which, of course, is a little baffled by the accusation. The immigration, clearly day one priority, lots of executive action there. And you add these two together and you've got the beginning opening shot with respect to defining a national emergency. Where you go from there, again, it's setting the groundwork for a major tariff offensive.
Thank you. And moving maybe south of the border, which is not it's an ally, Mexico, I think, and maybe different than Canada. What's the future of USMCA? And as you already mentioned, might be moved up in terms of timing for the review. What's your sense of USMCA in the future and the auto industry and a few other industries as well?
The auto industry is going to be wrecked by efforts to not just firm up the alliance against Chinese inputs infiltrating through Mexico and Canada, which is more of what we heard during the campaign trail. But since the inauguration day, the message is clear, including in Davos. It's about bringing more of what is in Canada and is in Mexico back to the United States. I always worried that this notion of ally and friend shoring was really code for pursuing autarky. And at least in autos, it's looking like that is more true than I would have ever imagined possible in 2025. There are so many dimensions to USMCA. The fact that Canada is in complete political disarray at the moment, not least over threats of acquiring the country as the 51st state. Trudeau has left a power vacuum. It's hard to understand what Parliament prorogued is able to do anytime soon. And Canada has largely gotten on the bandwagon in throwing Mexico under the bus and largely pointed a finger at Mexico as the root of all evil with respect to fraudulent and other Chinese inputs creeping into things that are made in North America. But the big question, Anil, is really, at what point is USMCA no longer worth the candle? There are a couple statistics that we might want to keep in mind. One is that for all that's said and done, Mexico largely exports to the United States under the WTO, not under USMCA. The other is that the Conservative Party in Canada was long leery of USMCA and affectionately referred to it as NAFTA 0.5. So for all those who are worried about what may happen as you speed up a review, there's a bigger worry. At what point is it no longer worth the candle? And by that, I mean, it was, in a lot of people's estimation, a mistake to ever have a sunset clause in USMCA. That was a birth defect of the agreement to begin with. And we knew it was going to draw something like this. But the reality is that Trump's priority in a review of USMCA will be to make rules of origin on autos more stringent. He tried. Prior to the original negotiation of USMCA, his numbers are completely unsustainable. He wanted 85% regional value content. The auto industry explained not possible. To pump up now, he already has studies from the ITC and USTR demonstrating that any movement of the rules of origin will lead part suppliers and others to trade under WTO rules. So where is this all going? He's going to have to completely obliterate U.S. obligations under the WTO to make any of this mean anything under USMCA. To do that would be the final straw and would require Congress to finally claw back tariff authority in a pretty drastic way. So is it going to be worth the candle? That, for me, is the big question. And then finally, the Canadians and the Mexicans have to be looking at this, wondering if Trump can so willy-nilly obviate USMCA obligations. What's the point of a renegotiation where every day is a renegotiation in theory? This is really a crunch point, and I'm not sure that USMCA is nearly as valued by either Mexico or Canada as Trump seems to think.
Well, thank you, Mark. What a great discussion. Let's see what the next few days and weeks hold, and maybe I'll touch base on this podcast again after we've got an update on those studies in a few weeks. Well, thank you, Mark, as always. Thanks for the discussion, and signing off here. Take care. Bye.